Hello and welcome to COS Indiana Live as we bring you Roundtable. The Roundtable segment is presented here every fourth Monday of the month at 7 p.m. We'll be focusing on education and discussion of the topics and challenges we all face as we use the Constitution to save the Constitution. Join us now as we bring you COS Indiana Roundtable with our MC, John Ackerman.
Welcome back to COS Indiana Live Roundtable. I'm your host, John Ackerman. This is broadcast number 269 of COS Indiana Live, and our topic is the Bill of Rights, Don't You Dare, Part 1. I say Part 1 because there are so many things that the Bill of Rights says, don't you dare do this, federal government, that we can't cover them all in one roundtable. So this will begin tonight and it'll conclude at the next roundtable at the end of November. So let's bring the rest of the panel on right now and get started. It's always fun to see who comes in first. Dale Parrish, our regular host for COS Indiana Live. Welcome, Dale, to the roundtable.
How you doing? How you doing?
You're looking good. Yeah. And Ken, hey, right there next to your head is a QR code. Before we bring anybody else on, just tell our viewers what that QR code's all about.
Sure enough, John, that's a way for our viewers to actually kind of connect with us here at COS Indiana Live. And with your smartphone, you can snap that QR code and put in your name and email address, and you'll become a subscriber, which shows us support and also gives you access to a number of educational videos and other types of things that we put on there for that group that shows their support for COS Indiana Live. And we will put a URL in the chat tonight in case you don't have your phone with you. You'll still be able to connect.
Very good. And that QR code will remain there for the duration of the roundtable. Am I right?
That's true. Even recording.
Okay. So let's bring the rest of the panel on. And Gary Harbaugh, a great member of our Indiana team. Hi, Gary.
Good evening, gentlemen.
Good to see you. And just to mix it up, we've got a gentle lady, Debbie Stewart, our constitutional expert. Welcome back, Debbie. Good to have you here when we're talking about the Bill of Rights. And our state director from Missouri, or is it Missouri? Brett Sturley.
Either one. We don't speak English. We don't speak proper English here in the Ozarks.
Okay, well, that's funny. You've been here before, and it's a great pleasure to have you back. So welcome back, Brett.
Always great.
Well, here's the deal. All right, here's the deal. Last month, we looked at the powers that the Constitution gives the president. The month before, we studied the powers that are granted to Congress by the Constitution. And tonight, we're going to look at the other side of the coin. We're going to focus on what the federal government is forbidden from doing. The things that the Bill of Rights says, don't you dare. Now, a little bit of history. The Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution because the Constitution lacked limits on government power. Now, on the one hand, the Federalists advocated for a strong national government. They believed that the people and the states automatically kept any powers not given to the federal government, and the anti-Federalists wanted power to remain with state and local governments and favored a Bill of Rights to safeguard individual liberty. So the Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution shortly after it was ratified and adopted. Now, the First Amendment is packed full of goodies, and we're going to spend most of the hour just talking about what the First Amendment says to the federal government, don't do this. First Amendment has 5 issues. Number 1, and Brett is going to talk to us about this one. It says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Take it away, Brett.
Well, thanks, John. I appreciate it, and thanks. It's great to be in here with everybody. And yeah, it's the First Amendment's very, very important. Like John said, there's 5 different rights that are protected there. And I think that one thing, there's some confusion sometimes. The Constitution does not grant any rights. What John said was exactly correct. It's a list of negative liberties. It's things that the federal government cannot do to the individual. And so that's really the thing that you really want to go in that mindset, that this is a limiting document of what the federal government can do. And the first part of this was, one of the main parts. I kind of want to go back a little bit in history, a little bit before the drafting of the Bill of Rights, and go back into around 1608. 1608, there was a group of Pilgrim separatists that there was the Church of England, the Anglican Church, and it was decreed by the king that everybody had to belong to the Anglican Church. And you had Roman Catholics, you had Methodists, you had Quakers, you had Puritans, you had Protestants, and then you also had Anglicans as well. People wanted to worship their own way, and they were unable to do that without being persecuted by the British Crown. And so back in 1608, they were financed by some private interests to go to Holland, where they spent about 12 years in Holland, and they were able to have free exercise of religion, and they were able to worship in the time and manner that they wanted to. At a certain point in time, they decided, you know what, we want to go to the New World. This isn't really our country. We want to forge out and start a new country of our own, a new territory, and colonize a new territory, and have this being ours, our native country from day one. So they set off in the Mayflower and took about a 66-day journey over. They were going to land in Virginia. That's where they were chartered and contracted to land. And they drifted a little bit far north, and they ended up in Massachusetts, up in around Cape Cod is where they actually made landfall. And so they, disembarked, and they decided that, we're not governed by any type of a document here. We have no government, and we need to have some type of way to have civil order. So they drafted the Mayflower Compact. And it's very, very brief, but I think it's interesting the way that it's worded. So I'll just read it here real quick. In the name of God, amen. We whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord King James. You can see real term of endearment right there. By the grace of God, of Britain, France, and Ireland King, defender of the faith, etc. Having undertaken for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith, in honor of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by these presents solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one another, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends of aforesaid, and by virtue hereof do enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices from time to time, as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. So this is actually the Mayflower Compact in 1620, and actually it was just it was drafted in November 11th. So just here in a couple of weeks, it'll have its. I went to public school. I'm not sure what year that is, but it's a long time ago. It's I guess 404 years, I guess, wouldn't it be? Is that right? Yeah. But so this was actually the first self-governing document that was ever drafted. Most governing documents were drafted by the king or the head of the state, or the central government. And so, but you look at what they did. This was for the advancement of the Christian faith. And it's interesting that the colonies were populated by and separated by faith. You had the Quakers in Pennsylvania, you had Puritans, you had Roman Catholics, you had even Anglicans, you had Protestants. This is the original separation of the states, and so this was really in foremost in their mind that a primary reason why they came to the New World is freedom of religion and freedom to exercise religion as they saw fit. And so when you look at the First Amendment, the one thing in the Constitution, it always goes back, and it goes back to a grievance that's in the Declaration of Independence. And this is really, I think the main grievance in the Declaration of Independence that that the First Amendment's a remedy of, at least with the freedom of religion, is in our preamble. It said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So that right there just says that man, the king included, is not at the top of the food chain. Our rights and the ability for us to exercise our rights comes from God. And so this was kind of a main grievance that the King of England, King George III, did not assent, or King James at that time, did not assent to these laws, and did not acknowledge natural law. So that was really the primary grievance that the free exercise of religion in the First Amendment was designed to address. And it really, when you hear people talk about the separation of church and state and this and that, you can really see from all our founding documents that the primary reason why our country was founded and the Constitution was written the way that it was, and our government set up the way that it is to preserve religious liberty, and was founded in those Judeo-Christian principles. So that's just, I think it's no accident that freedom of religion is the first right that's protected from government tyranny in the First Amendment.
The very first right. Thank you, Brett. That's great. Yeah. But by the way, if you're watching on Facebook Live or YouTube Live, you can join the conversation. Just make a comment there in the comment box. Ken is monitoring that. And if anything comes up that we have time to get to, he'll bring it up on the screen. And Ken will just give me a little hand signal when he's got something. And so your voice counts too as you're watching this. So thanks, Brett, for talking to us about that. Now, the second thing that the federal government is prohibited from doing, the First Amendment, thing number 2, says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. Dale, speak to us.
Okay, John. Yes, freedom of speech, but there are some restrictions, and I'm going to list some types of speech that are restricted by the government, and basically restricted to protect public safety and order, protect individual rights and national security. Okay, so here's some examples of restricted free speech. Speech that incitement to violence or illegal activities. Speech that intends to incite lawless action, especially if it's likely to occur. That's not protected. Threats, true threats of harm to individuals or groups, and obscenity, defined as content with no artistic, political, or scientific value that violates community standards. Obscenity is not protected. Another restriction, defamation, false statements about a person that harms their reputation. And number 5, child pornography. Any material depicting sexual abuse of minors is prohibited without exception. Hate speech leading to direct harm. Hate speech is generally protected. It loses protection if it directly incites violence or discrimination. And finally, false advertising, misleading or deceptive advertising that could harm consumers is subject to regulation and penalties. So those are examples of free speech that is in fact restricted. Now let
Okay.
me give you some examples, and these these are pretty good. As I go through these, there might be some examples coming to your mind that, well, nothing was done about this. So when I go through these, keep that in mind. Number one, now again, these are examples of violations of the freedom of speech. Okay.
Yeah.
Number one, censorship. Governments or organizations suppressing certain viewpoints, often seen in the banning of books, articles, or social media posts.
Hmm.
Really?
Yeah.
Criminalization of speech. Laws that punish individuals for expressing dissenting opinions, such as laws against blasphemy or sedition. Intimidation and violence. Threatening or attacking individuals for their speech, which can lead to self-censorship out of fear. Really? Okay. This is a good one. Disinformation laws. Regulations that restrict speech under the guise of combating false information, which can stifle legitimate discourse. Really?
Mhm. Yeah.
Are you beginning to think of some examples here that maybe have happened that people were not held accountable for, or government was not held accountable for?
All over the place.
Here's a good one. Internet censorship.
Mm.
Restrictions on online platforms, including blocking websites or content that express unpopular views.
Yep.
Surveillance, monitoring individuals. Communications to deter them from speaking freely. Academic freedom restrictions, limitations placed on academic discourse or research that challenge prevailing norms of beliefs. Well, you can. I would hope that as I went through that list, you're thinking of incidents and times when does the Hunter Biden laptop come to mind? There are many other examples, I
Yeah.
think, where they were true violations of freedom of speech, but no one or no people, no organization was held accountable.
Okay.
So they're only violations if, in my opinion, they're only violations if they're held accountable.
Okay.
And we have a lot to go there. So.
Great content, Dale. I would say that Twitter, in a funny way, was held accountable because Elon Musk bought it and exposed all the wrongdoing.
Yes, that's true. That's true.
Hey, let me go back to Brett for a minute. Dale, you were talking about violations of that freedom, and Brett, did you have an example of the violation of the Establishment of Religion clause?
Well, I did real quickly, and this has happened like about 3 or 4 days ago because Kamala Harris was in an interview, and the topic was abortion, which that's kind of like child. Well, I don't even call it abortion; it's child sacrifice. But that was the topic, and she was asked specifically by the interviewer, like, well, do you think that there'd be any concessions or considerations you would make to limit limit child sacrifice like religion? And Kamala Harris, I mean, just a stunning response, just said, no, I don't think that there's any concessions that should be made that should violate a person's right to control their own body.
Yep, I heard her say that too. Yep.
Just stunning. I mean, just stunning. I mean, they're saying the quiet part out loud now.
Well, and that's prohibiting the free exercise of religion. If your
Prohibiting
religion tells you that something is wrong and government forces you to do that,
and child sacrifice is not a constitutionally protected right. Freedom of religion, free exercise is.
thank you very much. Okay, back to the First Amendment. The third thing that the government is prohibited from doing is abridging the freedom of the press. And I'm going to ask Debbie to talk to us about that.
Okay, great. Well, thanks again for having me on. I love doing these shows, so I'm excited to be here again. So the third freedom, like you said, that was listed in the First Amendment is the freedom of the press. And it's important that those that are in the press are able to report freely without government intervention, or they don't have to get permission to report whatever it is they want to report, whether it's in a book, a newspaper, an article on the internet. So that's really important, and that's why our founding fathers put that in there. And keep in mind that King James didn't let anybody like publish a book unless he agreed to it. So we're going back from lots of restrictions. The history is that our founding fathers, they understood what a free press was, and it was inherited from English law. So, but that didn't mean that in England that the press was free. That doesn't mean that it always worked. England originally had things called licensing laws. Those were repealed in 1694, but they added a restriction law called seditious libel law. And that basically said you couldn't say anything about the king or the state or the church or other officers, or you could get in major trouble. But in 1734, a printer named John Peter Zenger challenged it. He challenged a governor in New York, and he actually won. And his statement was, truth is a defense against libel. So, libel is slander that's written down. So that kind of changed things a little bit. And then in the mid-1700s, many of the 13 colonies, they were starting to get printing presses. And so they began ridiculing the king, saying things about him, even denouncing some of the king's involvement in colonial affairs. Got a little more popular, and our founding fathers understood the power of the press and the need to remain free of government intervention. So here's the premise. Freedom of the press is not absolute. So you can say what you want, but you can be held liable if you say too much or stuff that's not correct, or you attack somebody. Kind of like what went along with what Dale was saying, but you can be held responsible if you hurt somebody or there's consequences to that. A recent example of the government abridging that freedom would be in Kansas. There was a 98-year-old co-owner of a printing press. So he has a small town newspaper, and the town got together, the police and one of the judges, maybe some council members, and they knew that that guy had dirt on their guy who they wanted to win. And so they literally raided the newspaper place. They raided the man's home, and they just, tried to get all the things that they could. So that was way violation of, our rights. So here was somebody who was persecuted because he was going to tell the truth, and they didn't like the truth.
Wow. Thanks, Debbie. It seems to me that the history and the philosophy of this thing is that the framers knew that we needed a free press in order to protect the people from government tyranny. And the press was the agent that would inquire of what's going on behind closed doors and what government is doing and expose government corruption. But today, so much of the press is in the pocket of politicians that much of the press, they're still free, of course, that the First Amendment guarantees that they're free, but they seem to be in cahoots with the government, not exploring and criticizing the government and exposing government corruption. So we've come a long way, and we need to go back. Yes, Debbie.
Well, I was going to say, I don't know if you guys have been to the Holocaust Museum, but when we went years ago, they had a whole thing on propaganda. I don't know if that's something that's always there or if it was there for a period of time, but hours and hours of looking at all the propaganda that the government used to get to become a tyrannical government. It just blew me away that they got away with that.
Yep. And we stand in danger of that. So we need to be sentinels and watch out for this and call out abuse when we see it, and cancel our subscription to newspapers that aren't doing their job. And I say that because not too long ago, I canceled a subscription to a newspaper that was not and still is not doing its job. Okay. Well, we're going to take a little break now from the roundtable, and we're going to show you some video clips of a Texas couple who were on the Capitol grounds back on January 6th. They never entered the Capitol building. They never participated in any violence, yet they've been convicted and were awaiting sentence when Dale Parrish interviewed them earlier this month. You'll see two clips because he interviewed them on two separate occasions. And then the third clip will be Dale's update on what happened subsequent to those interviews. So let's take a break and watch that video now.
I know your sentencing date has been changed a number of times, right?
Correct.
And I'm sure there's reasons for that, but your next date is October 22nd. Is that correct?
That is correct. They've changed it monthly ever since May 24th, and now we're scheduled for October 22nd.
Well, I can't imagine how that must feel. You're basically still prisoners in a way, right?
Yes, we are on home confinement. So
Home confinement.
Yep.
And every time and this keeps getting delayed and delayed. Wow. I don't know. Guys, we got to wrap it up here on this segment. But I want to bring you back, and we're going to continue on with this because there's a lot more to talk about. So will you come back to us?
Absolutely.
All right. We'll be back to you very shortly. Thank you.
Thank you.
Guys, I don't know what else to say, but other than thank you for what you're doing. You're certainly, I think we can say Convention of States is right there with you as far as reining in the breadth and control of the federal government and addressing overreach. So best of luck to you, and I hope we'll touch base with you as time goes on and see how things are going with you.
Absolutely. The difference will be made at the polls. That is going to be really the only way to save the January 6th defendants is for everybody to go to the polls. And let me tell you, just like Trump told you years ago, they're not after him, they're after you, and he's standing in the way. They're not after the January 6th defendant anymore. They're after you, and the J6ers are standing in the way.
So
I don't think we could close out any better. So thank you very much, Mark and Jaleese.
Thank you,
Dale.
Greetings, everyone. Dale Parrish, COS Indiana Live host. I wanted to bring you an update on this couple, Mark and Jaleese Middleton. The clips that you just watched came from our interview with them. Part 1 was on October 7th, and part 2 was on October 14th. And in those clips, as you watched and heard, their sentencing finally was to take place on October 22nd. And yes, these are J6 prisoners. So I wanted to bring to you a quick update on that sentencing. It did take place, and I'm going to show you. This is a picture of Mark and Jaleese on October 22nd after their sentencing. Jaleese was sentenced to 20 months in prison, 36 months supervised release. Mark was sentenced to 30 months in prison and 36 months supervised released. Now, the interesting thing, I believe, is these sentences take effect January 21st, 2025. It's kind of an interesting date, isn't it? Anyway, I've gotten to know these people, and I think they're really good people. These are a prime example of what has happened to many of the people that were involved in January 6th. So all I ask, folks, is that you keep Mark and Jaleese Middleton and their fund, American Patriot Relief, in your thoughts and prayers. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dale, for sharing those two clips and for giving us that update. It is interesting that the sentences begin the day after the next president is inaugurated.
Isn't it interesting? Yes.
So time will tell what will happen here.
We will see what happens. But this couple, they operate a fund, American Patriot Relief. It's a nonprofit, and it's to help January 6th prisoners as well as family members, whatever their needs may be. And, so they're really doing some great work. They keep maintaining a 24/7 hotline. And Ken and I, as we interview these people, I'm just amazed at the network that's out there to support these people. So, and Wendy Olson is our contributor that brings us these stories, and she does a great job finding these people. And we got more coming.
All right.
So,
is there a website where our viewers might be able to make a donation to their fund?
yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. And I think it's AmericanPatriotRelief.org, I believe.
Okay, Ken, you'll find that for us and
You have that, Ken? Yeah.
Put it in the chat or something. Okay, Ken, thank you.
Go to that website. You can adopt a J6er. So and any donation is strictly donation, and Mark and Jaleese do not gain any financial benefit from this. So
okay. Well, speaking only for myself here, let me be clear. The few people who did commit acts of violence and destruction in the Capitol ought to and need to be prosecuted.
Yes.
To the fullest extent of the law, as they say. But people who are there to peacefully and patriotically make their voice heard are being railroaded by this. Is it the DOJ or is it the City of Washington prosecutor? Somebody's prosecuting them.
I think it's the DOJ.
Okay.
FBI.
Being railroaded.
Yeah.
Well, this video and the circumstance of this couple and probably many hundreds of others are a perfect lead-in to the next right that is listed in the First Amendment. And that is that Congress shall make no law prohibiting the right of the people peaceably to assemble. And Dale's going to explain that one to us.
All right. Yes, we have the right to peaceably assemble. However, there are some restrictions on that. And as I go through these, you might want to keep January 6th in mind. Okay. And I'm sure we could think of some others, like the riots of, what was it, 2020,
the Summer of Love. After the George Floyd death.
Floyd. Okay. Here's the restrictions. Okay. The restrictions, violent or riotous gatherings, obviously, assemblies that include or involve or incite violence. Okay. Rioting, looting, or property destruction. Okay. And here's a real good one, a restriction, blocking public access, protest or assemblies that obstruct traffic, block entrances, or prevent access to public or private facilities without permission can be restricted. Really?
Okay.
Trespassing on private property. The right to assemble does not grant the right to gather on private property without the owner's permission. The obstruction of government functions. Protests or assemblies that interfere with government functions, such as blocking courthouses or interfering with police, are restricted. Assemblies without a permit. Okay, in many cases, you have to have a permit to assemble. And assemblies that incite imminent lawlessness. In other words, similar to speech, assemblies that intended to incite illegal actions against other people. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
So those are some of the restrictions. Okay, here we go. Now we get into some examples of violations of this right. Unlawful dispersal. Law enforcement breaking up peaceful protests or gatherings without just cause, often using excessive force. Mm-hmm. Permit denials. Authorities refusing to grant permits for demonstrators based on the content of their message. Again, now these are examples of violations. Surveillance and monitoring. Monitoring peaceful assemblies through surveillance, which can create a chilling effect on individuals willing to participate.
Mm-hmm.
Does that ring a bell?
Recent examples abound.
Arrest and detentions. Arresting individuals for merely participating in a peaceful assembly or for minor infractions during a protest. Many of these J6 people were this is what they were arrested for.
Yeah.
Violence from counter protesters. Now this is an interesting. Failing to protect peaceful assemblies from violence or harassment by counter protesters or extremist groups. Does BLM or does Antifa ring a bell?
Yeah.
Intimidation tactics, using intimidation or harassment against individuals or groups. Disinformation campaigns. Really? Spreading false information to undermine the legitimacy of a peaceful assembly. Discouraging participation or inflaming intentions. I don't know how many examples came to your mind, but there just seems to me, once again, these are violations. But if people are not held accountable, if they're not held accountable for these things, these violations, they just go by the wayside.
Yep. Okay, Dale. Thank you.
That's what I got there, John.
Okay, we're going to move on to the fifth and final issue that's addressed by the First Amendment, and that is that Congress shall make no law restricting the right of the people to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Now, Gary, this is the longest you've ever been quiet on a round table, but it is your turn now to wax eloquent.
Well, John, one of the things that should be apparent, but maybe it's not, so I'm just going to say it, and that is that if you look at the rights under the First Amendment, they're all intertwined together. In fact, we haven't talked much about the freedom of religion again, or the prohibition of establishing a particular religion, but a lot of the activities that have taken place under the First Amendment in terms of protests, free speech, limitations on speech, all of these have had to do with people who are exercising their right to speak in relation to their religion, and particularly on the whole issue of abortion. So the right to petition the government for redress of grievances, typically we're talking about assembly, where people come together to protest, to say something that they don't like about what the government's doing. And if we read this amendment, it's very broad. And the court, at least many years ago, liked to say that it was to be interpreted broadly. And they even recognized that actions that could be symbolic actions were a form of speech. But the courts have kind of reined that in. They've, in effect, broadened the power of government to limit the right of the people to assemble peaceably and express their grievances to the government. So, for example, there's a case in Boston where a group of young men got together and burned their draft cards. You guys remember back in the day and during the Vietnam War. And a guy was prosecuted for this. And his argument was, hey, burning my draft card, this is symbolic speech. And the court gave lip service to the idea that, yeah, you could have symbolic speech. Doing an action that had an unspoken, in effect, message was really a form of free speech. But what did the court do? The court said, nah, not in this case. And interestingly enough, one of the dissents in that opinion said, hey, you know what? They were relying on a case from during World War I, and this particular justice of the Supreme Court pointed out, guess what? Even though, yeah, we're in the Vietnam War, it's not a declared war, so the government really shouldn't be limiting this. There was another one in 1984 when a group of people were protesting homelessness in Washington, D.C., and they requested a permit to protest on the mall. And because they were protesting homelessness, they wanted to bring about 150 people together and be able to camp overnight on the mall, sort of symbolically. Hey, this is symbolic of what homeless people have to do. They have to sleep out in the open, and their permit was to request for this overnight thing to take place on the first day of winter. And again, the Supreme Court sided with the government to say, you know, well, the Park Service really doesn't have overnight, camping in the park. They don't permit overnight camping. Therefore, they refused to permit them to do this overnight. On the other hand, going back to 1969, there was a pretty good decision, I think. I don't know that it would be decided the same way today, but the Ku Klux Klan held a protest rally in Ohio, and all kinds of incitement to, we're going to go to Washington, we're going to march, we're going to commit acts of violence. I was convicted. The Supreme Court said, because it did not involve an imminent threat of violence, an imminent threat of action right then, that he could not be prosecuted for saying those things. That might have been the high water mark for this freedom. And I think that we look at this today, and we look at what's happened certainly in the past 10 years, and we can see that the government likes to pay lip service to the idea of freedom of speech. But if we look at what they actually do, we see over and over again that they put limits on people's ability to speak. Going back to the abortion issue, they've said that a law that says you can't protest within 100 feet of an abortion clinic, or you can't talk to anybody within 100 feet of the door of an abortion clinic, that these kind of restrictions should be upheld. So in some ways, in many ways, the First Amendment, while the letter of it is still there, the Supreme Court has extinguished much of the flame of the reality of the rights that we, the people, have and should have, that were to be guaranteed by the First Amendment. And perhaps we, the people, have to once again assert that these are our rights. They come from God, not from government.
Very, very good, Gary. We need to rekindle the flame of the right of the people to petition government for redress of grievances. Yes, indeed. Thanks, Gary. Well, that's all 5 of the restrictions placed on government in the First Amendment. So finally, now we're going to move to the Second Amendment, which says a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Debbie, talk to us about this one.
Okay. Well, first of all, this is an enumerated right. It's spelled out very, very clearly in the Constitution. But there are people who want to get rid of the Second Amendment. So I thought it was interesting that in 2008, there was a case called District of Columbia versus Heller. And during this, there was a prior, Clinton's prior lawyer and then a George W. Bush lawyer. And the Clinton lawyer was arguing that it referred to the militia only and not to the individual. And so that was the first kind of argument, was that, does it protect the rights of all individuals or just like government official militia? And so they decided that the justice decided, well, it speaks of the right of the people at the beginning of it. So that argument did not hold any water. The second argument was that, does the Second Amendment apply to the states? And of course, the answer was yes. So it's really interesting how they're trying to go around the back door to find some way to get rid of this amendment. And the right of Americans to self-defense drives that amendment.
Mhm.
We all have the right to self-defense. So, and the language of the Second Amendment clearly echoes the language of the British statutes, and it too addresses the right of individuals. So again, they kind of went along with what England was doing. A little history, back in 1774, here in America, in the colonies, there was an import ban on firearms. And then 74, 75, the king wanted to confiscate all the guns and the gunpowder. So they knew, our founding fathers knew where they were going, and they wanted to take every measure they could to make sure that you are not going to take that right away from individuals and local governments. They knew this was a fundamental right of all the people to keep the government at bay. And even Thomas Jefferson, a couple quotes from him, he said, "No free man shall even be debarred the use of arms." And he also said, "I prefer dangerous freedom over peaceful slavery." I love that one. Dangerous freedom over peaceful slavery, right? Freedom over safety, right? So back in 1685, King James II in England persecuted the Protestants. He disarmed them. And then William and Mary came over and they took over. And then they signed in the English Bill of Rights, which led to our amendment. It said that they could keep and bear arms. And then America then drew from those English Bill of Rights and then codified it so it could not be taken away. Mm-hmm. And then as far as an example of a violation, this was just this June, but the Supreme Court set some outer boundaries on the constitutional right to bear firearms. We call these red flag laws, but they prohibit a person with a domestic violence restraining order from possessing a firearm. Now, some people would say, well, that makes sense, but is that constitutional? That's the question. So the article talked about how in the last decade or two, the Supreme Court has been expanding the Second Amendment, but this time they brought some little restriction in on that.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. And let it be clearly understood that Convention of States stands firmly behind the whole Constitution, including the Second Amendment. One of the things that our opposition says is that, oh, if you have a convention, they'll do away with the Second Amendment. No, that's not the intent, and it can't happen. The way the convention will be conducted, it can't happen. Your Second Amendment is safe, it's protected. Don't buy the lies from the opposition that says they want to take all of our guns, Mm-hmm. So thanks, Debbie. Thanks for that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Now we move on to the Third Amendment, which is quite interesting. It says, "No soldier shall in time of peace be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law." Brett, help me understand this one.
Yeah, this is a little bit of a bizarre one that you sit there and you read this, without really having the background of history, and you read this, you're just like, what were they thinking when they put this in? This doesn't make any sense. Who would have thought, the army's rolling down our street and they just decide to come in our house? But you look, that's exactly what happened. And again, this comes back, to the preamble, the Declaration of Independence, that we have, originally those rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Originally, that was the original drafts were life, liberty, and the pursuit of property.
property,
because it was enjoyment of property and gaining by your endeavors and your industriousness and your creativity. You know, you should be able to enjoy you kind of the fruits of your labor. That was later changed to pursuit of happiness, but it was still it was based on personal property rights. And that was one thing. If you look back between the Jamestown colony and the Plymouth colony, you know, the Jamestown colony was basically founded originally in socialism. There was community property. Everybody could just farm their the community property and enjoy and share the bounty of those fields. And it pretty well, you know, that didn't work. The Plymouth colony decided to do this a little bit differently and just actually have people have possession of their own property. Well, you fast forward in 1776, and you know, even before the Revolutionary War, and this was a grievance. Actually, it was grievance numbers 14 and 11 in the Declaration of Independence, to where it actually just went back and said, you know, it prohibited the quartering of troops. That was one of the complaints, the quartering of troops. So you just imagine that here, you know, we're an independent people. We have founded these new states that are meant to be free and independent. We're still British subjects, but we're continually being subjected to the tyranny of the British Crown, of ignoring laws, of unjust imprisonment, and then these infringements on our personal rights are being enforced by British regulars from the British Army that are over here. And then they're not only persecuting us, but then they can come into our home and just say, you know what, we're going to bed down here for the night. By the way, what do you have to eat? I think we're going to go ahead. We're going to eat this. So we're going to start basically. There were no personal property rights. When the British regulars, you know, came to town, they decided that they could just go ahead and just commandeer whatever you had and whatever they wanted to, and consume basically your personal property. So that was one thing. That was what the Third Amendment was targeted for. That no, you can't do that. You cannot force us to house and quarter our troops in a you know, unless it's specifically prescribed. And again, just think about that, the frame of mind here in the Constitution, that it's based upon the consent of the governed. It would not be that the federal government would come in and just say, okay, you know, John, Ken, Dale, you guys are going to house these American troops, you know, no, I don't consent to that. You know, so this has to be a fair and just law. But that was really, you know, where they were looking at. And if you look at a modern day, I guess the closest modern day version of this that we have, and I think the FBI has come right up to that line, unless they, in some instances, it could be argued that they've crossed it with some of their raids. You know, Gary was talking about, you know, the violations of the FACE Act. You know, we've seen these videos of you know, people being at their home. Maybe they just went to a Planned Parenthood, to a child sacrifice facility, and they weren't preventing anybody from getting in, but they were just praying, or maybe reciting Bible verses or something like that. Well, then they end up getting raided and drug out of their home, typically in the wee hours of the morning. And they do that on purpose because you're off guard, and there'll be less of a chance that there'll be any type of a pushback from the person they're going there to get. But I think that's a modern day, a real time example of this. You look at the raid on Mar-a-Lago as well, where they went through President Trump's residence, through the private residence quarters, through Melania Trump's effects, and Barron Trump's room, That could be a violation, although they weren't quartering troops, but they weren't housed there. They were there for a limited period of time. And so, I think that's the closest thing that we have here in modern times. And hopefully we don't ever, have to cross that bridge again. But that was a real thing back in the founding era. And that's why they wanted to protect personal property rights. And that's why it's so high up in the Bill of Rights.
Yeah. Good history lesson. Thanks, Brett. Because it was a real issue in the colonial days. And because of the Third Amendment, if the government follows the Third Amendment, that will never happen again. And we don't need to worry about troops coming in and quartering in our own private homes. Wow.
Hopefully.
Yeah. Well, this brings us to the end of this month's roundtable. Before we close it out, I want to give you our email address. If you have any questions about Convention of States, you can email them to us at this address, raiseyourvoicecos@gmail.com. That's raiseyourvoicecos@gmail.com. I want to invite you to tune in next Monday, November the 4th at 7 p.m. Eastern for our next COS Indiana Live, where we're going to have Lieutenant Colonel Larry Brock Jr. with parts 2 and 3 of what he has to say, along with a COS basics lesson. And the next roundtable will be the second half of the Bill of Rights, Don't You Dare, and it'll be on the fourth Monday of November. That's the 25th, November 25th at 7 p.m. Eastern. Don't You Dare, Part 2. To close us out, here's an episode of COS Basics, Busting the Myth that there are no safeguards to an Article 5 convention. John Ackerman for Convention of States, Indiana. In this episode of COS Basics, I'm continuing to bust myths. This myth is that an Article 5 convention has no safeguards. It won't protect our Constitution from rogue delegates or special interest groups. That's the myth. The fact is contrary to the myth, wouldn't you know? The fact is that significant safeguards exist to prevent corruption. They include, number one, the limited scope of an amendments convention. The scope of authority for the convention is defined by the topic, which is specified in the 34 applications that trigger the convention. Any proposals beyond that scope would simply be out of order. Number two, restrictions on commissioner authority. Convention commissioners are the agents of their state legislature and are subject to the instructions given by their state legislature. The state legislature can recall commissioners who attempt to exceed their authority, and actions taken outside the scope of a commissioner's authority would be void. If state legislatures failed to stop commissioners from acting beyond their powers, and if a majority of state delegations voted to propose an amendment that's outside the scope of the convention, and if Congress nevertheless sent that amendment to the states for ratification, the courts could declare that amendment null and void. The third safeguard is state voting requirements. It's a requirement that 38 states ratify any amendment proposed by the convention. That means only 13 states are needed to block any ill-conceived or illegitimately advocated proposal. The convention cannot change the method of ratification. Finally, the United States Supreme Court has stated that an Article 5 Amendments Convention is empowered by the United States Constitution and is subject to its rules. And so the myth that an Article 5 convention has no safeguards, busted.